with the advent of the atomic bomb and nuclear weapons, the world is permanently different, okay? It's done. There is no going back on that. I feel like friend of the show, I know that we're doing too much Sloppenheimer here, but I feel like friend of the show, Shaun, didn't he make a video about this before, like years ago? Dropping the bomb, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's 2 hours long, but I think like it basically shows, and I'm not going to watch 2 hours of this content, obviously, but it basically shows, you know, it's a really good video, really, really educational on the unconditional surrender aspect is what I kind of want to talk about.
I only know that for whatever reason, when he wrote that, he was wrong. Now, leaving the nuclear bombs to the side for a moment, I wouldn't blame someone for asking at this point. If Truman and Burns are apparently so anxious to get the war over with before the Russians get involved, and they knew at Potsdam that the Emperor was asking for peace, why was peace not able to be negotiated sooner than it was? Why, when they heard the Emperor wanted peace, did they not simply send him a message saying, great, okay, let's negotiate peace? And the answer to that is the deadlock over unconditional surrender. As we know, Japan was committed to avoiding an unconditional surrender. But Truman was likewise committed to securing one. He didn't want to accept what the Japanese were offering, which was a negotiated peace. He wanted a full unconditional surrender. Now, various individuals within the Allied governments and armed forces understood that insisting on absolute unconditional surrender was, particularly with regards to the question of the Emperor, going to cause problems and possibly prolong the war. While at the Yalta Conference, Winston Churchill suggested that mitigating the terms of surrender, quote, would be worthwhile if it led to the saving of a year or a year and a half of war in which so much blood and treasure would be poured out. But President Roosevelt was unreceptive to Churchill's suggestion. Not to be deterred, however, Churchill tried again when talking to Truman at Potsdam, and he later gave an account of the conversation. I dwelt upon the tremendous cost in American life and to a smaller extent in British life which would be involved in forcing unconditional surrender upon the Japanese. It was for him to consider whether this might not be expressed in some other way, so that we got all the essentials for future peace and security, and yet left the Japanese some show of saving their military honour and some assurance of their national existence. However, Churchill found this president as unreceptive as the last. Truman, quote, countered by saying that he did not think the Japanese had any military honour after Pearl Harbor, but Churchill responded that, at any rate, they had something for which they were ready to face certain death in very large numbers, and this might not be so important to us as to them. Others attempted to influence Truman on the unconditional surrender issue at various times, sometimes seemingly having more luck than Churchill there. Under-Secretary of State Joseph Grew, who understood the importance of the Emperor having been US ambassador to Japan for a decade, advised Truman on the 28th of May that the greatest obstacle to unconditional surrender by the Japanese is their belief that this would entail the destruction or permanent removal of the Emperor and the institution of the throne. And Grew goes on to say that without an assurance that the imperial institution would not be destroyed, a Japanese surrender would be highly unlikely. And he further notes that the president said that he was interested in what I said because his own thoughts had been following the same line. Another of Truman's advisors who took a similar line was Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who spoke to Truman on the 2nd of July on the issue of drafting surrender terms for Japan, stating that, I personally think that if we should add that we do not exclude a constitutional monarchy under her present dynasty, it would substantially add to the chances of acceptance.
We're not watching the whole thing.
Stimson later wrote in his diary that Truman was, quote, apparently acquiescent with my attitude towards the treatment of Japan. Now, I think there's two possibilities here. The first is that President Harry S. Truman was one of those intensely annoying people who simply agree with whatever the last person they spoke to said to them, showing absolutely no respect for future historians attempting to figure out what they actually thought about anything. The second is that Truman was actually sympathetic to what his advisors were advising him with regards to softening unconditional surrender, but there was some other influence preventing him from acting on that advice. And we perhaps see a hint of this at a meeting on the 18th of June, when this time Admiral Leahy tried his luck at pushing for a softening of unconditional surrender, stating that our insistence on unconditional surrender would result only in making the Japanese desperate and thereby increase our casualty lists. And Truman responded that he did not feel that he could take any action at this time to change public opinion on the matter. So, the opinion of the public is being factored into the decision-making process regarding Japanese surrender terms. And I think it's fair to say that the United States public were not the biggest fans of Emperor Hirohito. A Gallup poll conducted on the 29th of June reported that when asked what the fate of the emperor should be after the war, the most popular response was execute him. So any US president with an eye on public opinion is in a bit of a tricky position when it comes to openly telling Japan they can keep their emperor, especially if said US president has a history of calling for unconditional surrender. Just about the only person not advising Truman to soften the surrender terms was James Burns, who will later rather dramatically state that Truman appearing to back down from unconditional surrender would lead to the crucifixion of the president. All of this is complicated by the fact that behind...
I mean, but for the record, he's just laying out the details here. It's not like Shaun is taking this position as like, he's not taking this position verbatim and taking it for granted. He's just laying out what some of the positions of the Truman side were. Like, what were the important details as to why they continued on with dropping the bomb. Anyway, let's continue.
To the scenes, the leadership of the Allied military did not desire to get rid of the Emperor. In fact, there was actually a pressing military reason to retain the Emperor, and to quote a meeting of the Combined Chiefs of Staff that took place on the 16th of July, when discussing unconditional surrender, it was suggested that, if, for instance, an interpretation could be found and communicated to the Japanese which did not involve the dissolution of the imperial institution, the Emperor would be in a position to order the ceasefire in outlying areas, whereas if the dynasty were destroyed, the outlying garrisons might continue to fight for many months or years. So the proposal here is to leave the Emperor in place and use his influence to convince the scattered Japanese troops to stand down, whereas if they simply kill or imprison the Emperor, that might prompt the troops to fight on. So Truman's being pulled in different directions here. Strictly militarily speaking, letting Japan keep the Emperor makes a lot of sense. It will almost certainly shorten the war, save lives, and be the thing to convince the Japanese military to give up. Conveying that message to the Japanese leadership prior to their surrender, though...
Yeah, wait till you find out that they actually did do that, by the way.
...is potentially risky from a domestic political standpoint. If you've previously been calling for unconditional surrender, you don't want to be seen as reversing position on that and giving in to a hated enemy's demands. However, the threat of the Soviet Union's expansion into Asia means you do want to end the war quickly. So there's conflicting motivations here, and these conflicting motivations came to influence the construction of the Potsdam Declaration. Now, this was a statement issued by the Allies on the 26th of July that called for the unconditional surrender of Japan, saying, "We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction." And it laid out various terms, such as the occupation of Japanese territory by the Allies, the disarming of the Japanese military, and so on. Notably, however, the Potsdam Declaration did not contain any mention of the Emperor, which you might think is rather odd, given that the Allies clearly know how important the question of the imperial institution was to the Japanese leadership. However, it did state that the authority and influence of those who have deceived and misled the people of Japan...
Anyone that says chat's gonna defend Hito, don't execute the Emperor, ain't no way, like, misses the point by the widest of fucking margins. Okay, oh, he was just shitposting. Never mind. I was going to say, like, yeah, obviously, these are not good fucking people, except America very clearly did not give a fuck about the evil atrocities that Japan was openly committing, considering that they offered full carte blanche protection to, like, pretty much everyone that was engaging in germ warfare and even grosser and more psychotic scientific experiments in China. Unit 731 got full clearance and full protection so that they could hand over all of their important experimentations so they could learn from that and then utilize it in Korea. So remember that, like, America being the good guy in this situation is... And before people say, well, the Russians did it too, yes, that is true. But as it pertains to Japan, the Russians did want to actually at least try them. America very openly stood in front of that and stopped that from happening.
And into embarking on world conquest must be eliminated for all time. And this is rather vague with respect to exactly who it means. Does the Emperor count as one of those who have misled the people of Japan? When the Japanese leadership received the Potsdam Declaration, the hardliners on the Supreme Council interpreted this in a very unfavourable way and took it to be an indirect threat to the Emperor's life. Another confusing point for the Japanese leadership was that when the Potsdam Declaration was issued, it was signed by the United States, Britain, China, and, interestingly, not the Soviet Union. To the Supreme Council, this inspired a question, as well as a fair bit of false hope. If the Soviet Union didn't sign this declaration, does that mean that they possibly disagree with the declaration? What is Russia's position here? Since they didn't sign the document calling for our unconditional surrender, does that mean they might be open to negotiating better terms for us after all? After receiving the Potsdam Declaration, Togo met with the Emperor to discuss it. The Emperor thought that the terms of the declaration were, quote, acceptable in principle, but he agreed to postpone a response until after they had heard back from the Soviet Union. So Togo sent a message to Ambassador Sato on the 28th of July with instructions to attempt to sound out the Russian attitude towards the joint declaration. Ambassador Sato, for his part, had just about enough of this nonsense. He had been repeatedly saying that the Russia plan was not going to work, and yet here's another message.
Thank you, Hasan. This video has cleared up my misconceptions taught in school. Unconditional surrender is not an excuse to use atomic weapons. Oh, look at that. Also definitely trying to threaten the Soviet Union and their presence in Manchuria.
From Tokyo postponing surrender in order to ask what the situation is with the Russians. Sato's messages in response were openly insubordinate and strayed into brazenly telling Tokyo what to do. Sato said, and I'm paraphrasing here, look, if Stalin disagreed with the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, he would have negotiated better terms at the time. And if he wasn't able to negotiate better terms at the time, he's not going to be able to do that now, is he? The Soviet Union is not going to help you. In fact, if you don't immediately surrender, they are probably going to declare war on you. The Supreme Council, on receiving these messages, finally saw sense and decided to end the war. No, I'm joking. Sato was ignored, obviously. So the Potsdam Declaration contained no direct information about the fate of the Emperor, and it left open the question of the Soviet Union's position, which prompted the Japanese leadership to postpone a response until they knew what that was. Until then, their official position was to ignore the declaration. So if the Potsdam Declaration was intended to produce a surrender from Japan, it failed. However, when the Potsdam Declaration was first drafted by the Office of Secretary of War Henry Stimson, it included the following point. The occupying forces of the Allies shall be withdrawn from Japan as soon as our objectives are accomplished and there has been established beyond doubt a peacefully inclined, responsible government of a character representative of the Japanese people. This may include a constitutional monarchy under the present dynasty. So that is a concrete offer to retain the imperial institution right there. And earlier drafts of the Potsdam Declaration also included among the signatories the Generalissimo of the Soviet Union. So what happened here then? Well, between the first draft leaving Stimson's office and it being issued publicly, the Potsdam Declaration went through various drafts. Most importantly for us here, the document was edited by President Truman and James Burns. The final draft, of course, saw the Soviet Union being removed from the list of signatories and the offer to retain the imperial institution deleted. Firstly, on the issue of the Soviet Union being removed from the declaration, President Truman simply writes in his memoirs that Stalin could not, of course, be a party to the proclamation itself since he was still at peace with Japan. So that's Truman's stated reason for excluding the Soviet Union from the declaration. The Soviet Union is not yet in the war and technically still has a non-aggression pact in place with Japan, but why, we might ask, does this mean that the Soviet Union can't sign a document calling for Japan to surrender? I mean, Truman's stated intent for going to Potsdam was to convince the Russians to violate that non-aggression pact and have their military attack the Japanese military. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that respect for the sanctity of non-aggression pacts is clearly not the reason here. And if Truman is implying that he was worried that the Soviet Union signing the document would lead to war between Russia and Japan, well, that's what he's supposed to want to happen. In fact, the Soviet Union's exclusion from the final draft of the document came as an enormous surprise to the delegation from the Soviet Union, who had written their own draft of the Potsdam Declaration, which included themselves as signatories. So they clearly wanted in on the signing of the document. Instead, the Soviet delegation was not consulted about the drafting of the declaration and were only told it was being released to the press at the same time it was being released to the press. Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs Molotov submitted a request to delay the publication of the declaration, but James Burns claimed he didn't get the message in time. As for why the Soviet Union wanted to be included among the list of signatories, Stalin and Molotov wanted a pretext to abandon their non-aggression pact with Japan and invade Manchuria, and the Potsdam Declaration's ultimatum to Japan would have provided that pretext. So, after being edited out of the declaration, they tried a more direct approach. In a meeting on the 29th of July, Molotov submitted a request from Stalin for the United States, England, and the other allies, quote, to address a formal request to the Soviet government for its entry into the war. Now, this put Truman and Burns in a very awkward position, because, of course, they're supposed to want the Soviet government to enter the war, but they clearly don't anymore. As Burns later wrote in his memoirs, we had, of course, begun to hope a Japanese surrender might be imminent, and we did not want to urge the Russians to enter the war. Truman and Burns figure they just have to wait a week or so for the first nuclear bomb to be dropped, and then Japan will surrender before the Soviet Union.
Yeah, thank God. They just didn't want additional casualties for the Russians, you know? They were it's a double whammy. They didn't want to keep firebombing Tokyo, and they also just didn't want the Russians to engage with the Japanese. They were so thoughtful. Thank God they dropped the nuclear bomb or the atom bomb. Holy shit. Yeah, good guy Truman, dude, just saving Russians.
Has a chance to declare war and invade. So being asked directly for an invitation to the war put Truman on the spot, and he sidestepped the issue. The Soviets would get no invitation from him. However,
they wanted to use their COD kill streak before the end of the match. Dude, that is not even a joke. They're like, we spent $2 billion on this. We know the Russians are also simultaneously possibly, and the Germans and everyone else is like working to use this bomb. We have to show the world that we have it, and we have to show the world that we have it ×2, and we have more of it, and we can drop it at any given moment. Like they literally did that. They were like, well, it's my kill streak. Like, I should be able to use it. Fuck you.
However, an interesting note here is that when the Soviet Union does actually declare war on Japan, they say they have acceded to the Allied request to join the war. So they didn't get an invitation, but they just acted like they did anyway. Now, of course, excluding the Soviets from the Potsdam Declaration and dodging their request for an invitation to join the war confirmed to Stalin that Truman was planning to finish the war without him. So while at Potsdam, Stalin ordered his generals to speed up their invasion plans. He wasn't going to be left out of the kill. So I think it's fairly clear why the Soviet Union was excluded from the Potsdam Declaration. Burns and Truman are planning to finish the war without Stalin, and that includes not having Stalin's signature on the surrender papers. So when Japan surrenders, it will not be, in any way, a surrender to the Soviet Union, is the plan. The second important edit to the Potsdam Declaration was the removal of the offer to retain the imperial institution, and the reasoning for this change is found in the diary of Henry Stimson, who writes that, when the Potsdam Conditions were drawn and left my office where they originated, they contained a provision which permitted the continuance of the dynasty with certain conditions. The President and Burns struck that out. They were not obdurate on it, but they thought they could arrange it in the necessary secret negotiations which would take place after any armistice. So Truman and Burns think
the U.S. also did not want to have another D-Day style invasion, at least according to the World War II Museum in New Orleans. Yes, that is the American position, which I think the last, 20 minutes of us watching this kind of show that was not a real consideration. Because, look, once you're having a conversation, once your main ally has lost, okay? And your entire fucking soil is being firebombed. Okay? And on top of that, you've already begun talks. Like, you've already given conditional surrender up. It's done. After that, it's just a matter of talking. Like, Japan has nothing at that point. They know they're fucking done. Like, that's the reason why most schools don't even show that side of the conversation and instead just say, oh, well, the firebombing campaign was more gruesome, which is also ahistoric for the record. It was gross and gruesome, but it was a good way to stop the firebombing campaign because it would have been so much worse if they just kept firebombing the entirety of Japan. So that is the more common perspective that people put out there, which is that this was a more peaceful one-off way of avoiding further casualties from firebombing Tokyo and everywhere else.
The position of the emperor is a matter to be negotiated after Japan has already surrendered, and they're both convinced that the nuclear bomb is definitely about to force an unconditional surrender from Japan. Remember that Truman is, quote, sure that Japan will surrender when Manhattan appears over their homeland. So given that, why should they make any concessions beforehand and risk an unnecessary backlash? Truman and Burns plan to use the bomb to make Japan surrender unconditionally before Russia joins the war, and anything else, like the position of the emperor, can simply be sorted out afterwards. So here's the situation we're in at the end of the Potsdam Conference. The Japanese leadership is still refusing to accept an unconditional surrender, but Truman is refusing to accept anything less, even though on the principal point, the fate of the emperor, both sides are in agreement. They don't want to get rid of the emperor. But since neither side wanted to blink first, the deadlock remained. Japan waited for rescue from the Soviet Union that would never come, and the United States moved forward with the atomic bombings. The first atomic bomb was dropped in the center of Hiroshima on August 6th at about 8:15 in the morning. It exploded directly above a hospital, immediately killing everyone inside. Within the immediate blast radius were the Honkawa and Fukuromachi elementary schools, which were completely destroyed, instantly incinerating hundreds of school children. This is the purely military target right here.
So, the rest of it is more so about the impact of the bomb. I think there is like, what is it? There is like... Here, I'll give you a little bit more of Shaun's thoughts here.
And to actually defeat the Allies militarily. They had known that for quite a while. Then Russia or Japan turned up. Other than that, though, the Second World War was over. Just about. Now, with regards to our main topic today, we can ask a question. What effect did the nuclear bombs have on Japan's decision to end the war? Well, Japan needed three main things, I would argue, in order to end the war. Firstly, they had to be in a hopeless military situation with no chance of winning the war, and be aware of that. And this one we can tick off. The Japanese leadership knew it had no chance to actually...
What caused the surrender then? Dude, the surrender was coming. The surrender had already been presented. It was the conditions that the American government chose to either ignore or refuse to come to terms with until after they fucking dropped the nukes, and then they did actually come to terms with. That is what this entire video is about, by the way, which I highly recommend you guys watch. Like I said, Shaun, friend of the show, Shaun, made this video. It's 2 hours and 20 minutes long. Obviously, we're not going to watch the whole thing. I just wanted to show you the important aspects of like the unconditional surrender, and then a couple of his final conclusions after, you know, because he talks a lot about everything else. He's like Japan's aims, arms, but as it pertains to the main point of contention here, like what is taught in schools, I think these are some of the key moments that will give you a takeaway. The Japanese Navy was completely sunk, and the U.S. had complete air superiority over the entire Japanese mainland. Their ability to resist was nil. Exactly. Like anyone that goes against that is probably just like duped into believing that from American propaganda and American history being taught in schools. That's kind of what it is. It's just the way that it is unfortunately presented to make America's use of the atom bomb seemingly more positive. There's a lot of other nuclear, like pro-nuke propaganda, which I haven't even gotten to. It's pretty gross when you think about it, but there's the other side of this in the post-nuclear war, in the Cold War, the nuclear arms race being considered a positive thing because that's, you know, you never get two nations with nuclear arms warring one another. So it actually created a moment of peace on the planet. Like this is another very common perspective that mutually assured destruction is actually a good thing because it stops nation states from warring with one another. Except the reality is that we haven't stopped warring at all. And, you know, we just have proxy wars instead, Ukraine being a great example. And it's like literally countries that have less and that don't have nukes are the ones who are getting fucked over now. Reading all those books for that nuclear bomb video gave me a gigantic dislike for Oppenheimer and his belated weepiness. People were telling him. It's not like they didn't know what was going to happen. To ignore them and then only later cry about it is tremendously irritating. To be clear, he was very much not just a neutral scientist inventing a thing that was later used for war. This part is true. He was explicitly making a weapon. He had input on where and how it should be used, and he ignored petitions advocating for less lethal usage / demonstration of the bomb. He was 100% like, fuck yes, let's use this sucker ASAP, until afterwards when he got all performatively poetic and sad. Piss off with that. That's what he says. That's at least Shaun's perspective on it. Hasan, if a world war broke out, literally every nation would suffer. Yes, but this treats war as an inevitability. You understand? And already world wars are not happening in the same ways that you think it's happening. It's already happening for people in Ukraine. It's already happening for Syria. It's happening in Palestine. It's happening in Yemen. It's happening every fucking day. It's just that it's not happening in your immediate vicinity. The only thing that a world war shelters, the only thing that nuclear proliferation of this regard shelters, is people living in countries that have developed nuclear weapons. In countries that, and even then, not exactly, right? Because they do see the impact of such a thing. They do still see like the economic consequences of such decisions and whatnot, but like they don't, it just protects the imperial core. That's it. The U.S. would have 100p declared war on USSR if it weren't for nukes. I know, but we're talking about a world where we haven't engaged in nuclear proliferation. Do you understand what I'm saying? I do not believe that. I agree with a few topics, but Hasan, cringe overall. Thanks, Fruit Snacks. I'm glad that you agree at least. Maybe you're opening your mind up a little bit. I think that I do not believe that having a world-ending weapon is ever a good thing. I do not believe that having more access to weapons have made us more civilized when we see the exact opposite. All right, let's continue.
Actually defeat the Allies militarily. They had known that for quite a while. Their only hope for their military was to use whatever was left of it to drag out the war with the hopes of securing better peace terms for themselves. Secondly, Japan had to be in a hopeless diplomatic situation and be aware of that. Now, ever since the Russians signed the secret pact...
Does that also work with your take that more nations should get nukes? We're not talking... Okay, there's two different worlds, guys. There's two different worlds, okay? A lot of people point to the Hasanabi doctrine, which I always say, get nukes. There's two different universes, which I think the movie basically fucking showed perfectly. That's why the last beat of the movie is... I did actually create a chain reaction that destroyed the world. That's the whole point, because the world is forever different. With the advent of the atomic bomb and nuclear weapons, the world is permanently different, okay? It's done. There is no going back on that. That is why when I say this, I'm talking about realpolitik. I'm talking about the world as it exists in a post-nuclear proliferated world. Okay? Do you understand? My perspective on the matter is very different in a pre-nuclear world. Anyone ever think that it happened? Rehashing and putting shit into kids' minds isn't going to fix anything. This is the world we live in now. Wait, what? Non-proliferation is just not realistic. It's like, what if no one invented the light bulb? That's ridiculous. No, it's not like, what if no one invented the light bulb? There is a very real moment where leaders of the world, despite warring with one another, could have very easily, especially even after like Germany's defeat, could have very easily gotten to a point where they were like, all right, we should definitely stop this immediately. We should get together and we should just make a pact. We're not doing this. We're not fighting one another. You always have this same assumption that many people do, which is that like people are just going to be evil. Nations are going to be evil. We are always going to, we've literally agreed not to use chemical weapons. The U.S. and Nazi Germany didn't use mustard gas. Why is that, chat? Like, there are certain things we could have done. There are certain things we could have done at a given moment. And by the way, the reason why, for example, Central Committee is correct, but also, ironically, we now use chemical weapons all the fucking time. We use plenty of different techniques that we consider to be illegal and will literally tell other countries not to use. You want to know why? Because we dropped the bomb. We did it. To this day, we are the only country that dropped it on fucking civilian territory, okay? So that's the point. That's why now we get to literally do whatever the fuck we want. And there are so many like interesting ways in which we change the planet. We talk about the theoretical ways. We talk about the spiritual ways in some respects. But there are very literal physical ways in which we change the planet, like the fact that, for example, we have to rely on, if we want to get like X-ray proof material, we have to go and fucking engage in deep sea diving to find shipwrecks from a pre-atom bomb era, because every single piece of steel, every single piece of steel on the planet that was, you know, exposed to the elements when the atom bomb blew up is now technically corrupted. That's such an interesting thing to think about. You know, like every single aspect of this planet is like relatively irradiated. That's the old method. Modern smelters don't produce contaminated steel. Low background steel, also known as pre-war steel, is any steel produced prior to the detonation of the first nuclear bomb in 1940 and 1950s, typically sourced from ships, either as a part of regular scrapping or in shipwrecks and other steel artifacts in this era. It's often used for modern particle detectors because more modern steel is contaminated with traces of nuclear fallout. So did you like the movie or not? No, I loved the movie. The movie was great. It stands on its own as a movie. It's like great from a movie perspective. Anyway, I got to pee real quick.
Act to declare war on Japan at the Yalta Conference, the Japanese government was in a hopeless diplomatic situation. But for a long time, they didn't understand that they were. They held out hope for Russian mediation all the way until the Soviet Union declared war on them. Now, some of the actions of the Allies undoubtedly contributed to Japan not understanding the position they were in, principal among those probably being the Soviet Union's signature being struck off the Potsdam Declaration. But we also can't ignore the capacity for willful ignorance and self-deception among the members of the Japanese leadership. They should have known their situation was hopeless. After the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, however, the Japanese leadership finally understood this second point. And I'd like to add something here. The strategic bombing survey that I mentioned at the start of the video stated Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated. Now, I don't actually agree with that, on the Russia point anyway. I personally feel that if the Japanese leadership, with regards to getting help from the Soviet Union, thought there was any hope remaining whatsoever, they probably never would have surrendered even if it meant their entire country was burned to the ground. The Soviet Union declaring war on Japan was crucial in that it forced them to confront their hopeless diplomatic situation. To return to our list of things Japan needed in order to end the war, third is an assurance that the imperial institution would not be abolished. This was the main problem the Japanese leadership had with the Allied demand for unconditional surrender, of course. And I'd argue that the question of the emperor was the most important point on this list. And that's both on a national level, the emperor being a very important figure in Japanese society, but also on a personal level, because it's the emperor himself intervening to end the war. So an assurance that the emperor himself would not be executed as a result of doing that would probably help to speed things along there. People who defend the atomic bombings as being necessary often point to the bluster of the Japanese militarists who were, even after the bombings and the Russian declaration of war, still promising to fight to the last, with the desperate idea of somehow securing better terms for themselves. But they didn't do that once the emperor intervened. And the emperor intervened not to avoid more cities being destroyed. Remember, dozens of cities had already been destroyed. The emperor intervened to protect the imperial office. In a post-war interview, he explained one of his reasons for choosing to intervene as being that, quote, if the enemy landed near Ise Bay, both Ise and Atsuta shrines would immediately come under their control. There would be no time to transfer the sacred regalia of the imperial family, and no hope of protecting them. Now, you'd think that protecting the imperial knickknacks would be an unmentionably minor concern when compared to the nuclear bombing raids, but apparently not. The emperor took all this emperor business very seriously, as did the rest of the Japanese government. The militarists on the Supreme Council might have wanted to hold out for better terms, even if it meant fighting to the death, but they were not prepared to contradict the will of the emperor.
It sounds laughable in many respects, but it is the most believable thing about Japanese people in general, is that, oh, Jesus Christ, dude. Like 1,000,000%. Aspects of this kind of thinking have seeped into modern Japanese existence in very meaningful ways, which I've talked about time and time again. Some of which is positive, as a matter of fact, and has been a counterweight to existing under a really horrifyingly exploitative capitalist superstructure. But it is really interesting. Unbelievable.
Admiral Leahy wrote in his memoirs that himself and Secretary Stimson, in their combined staff meetings, were, quote, certain that the Mikado, that's an antiquated term for the emperor there, could stop the war with a royal word. And this turned out to be accurate. That is how the war was stopped on the Japanese end. Now, I don't want to get too deep into speculation about alternate history timelines today, but I think it's fairly obvious that President Truman and James Burns deleting the offer to retain the imperial institution from the Potsdam Declaration almost certainly lengthened the war. If the emperor didn't intervene to bring about a surrender immediately upon receiving peace terms that assured his position, he almost certainly would have when that was coupled with a Soviet declaration of war. Japan had only been holding out for Russian mediation in the hopes of securing better peace terms. After the Soviet declaration of war, that option was fully off the table, so I'd say it's vastly more likely than not that, having in hand both a declaration of war from the Soviet Union and surrender terms from the other allies that assured the imperial house would survive, the emperor would have ended the war right there, regardless of whether Japan had been hit with nuclear bombs or not. Henry Stimson later noted in his memoirs that it is possible, in light of the final surrender, that a clearer and earlier exposition of American willingness to retain the emperor would have produced an earlier ending to the war. And he concluded in 1948 that history might find that the United States, by its delay in stating its position, had prolonged the war. Now, it would be very simple to conclude at this point that, with regard to the end of the war, the question of the emperor was everything, and the nuclear bombs didn't do anything. But is that really the case? Let's pose a few questions. Firstly, we can ask, were the bombs necessary to defeat Japan militarily? And the answer to that is obviously no. The Japanese leadership were beaten, and they knew they were beaten long before the bombs were dropped. So, were the bombs necessary to defeat Japan without needing to carry out a ground invasion of the 4 main Japanese islands? Well, to start with, we've quoted multiple US military leaders today who say that Japan was ready to surrender without either an invasion or the bombs being necessary. But can we really trust their judgment of the situation? You see, those leaders had a couple of potential reasons to downplay the effectiveness of the bomb. The first of these is simply that they didn't want to be put out of a job by this thing. The worry there was that if the atomic bombs really are that effective, then maybe we don't need such a large conventional military force anymore, so clear your desk. And another reason, I imagine, was pride. If it's you who's been fighting the war all this time, backing Japan into a corner and bringing them to the verge of surrender, you probably don't want the narrative afterwards to be scientists save the day and end the war with their new bomb. It kind of undercuts all the work you did prior to that. So I can see the motive there for US military leaders at the time to say, hey, hang on, Japan was already beaten, we did that, the bomb was not necessary. However, these ulterior motives do not mean that the military leader...
He's thoroughly covering every angle. That's what Shaun does. Like, this doesn't mean that that's his genuine perspective on it. I just want everyone to understand.
Who spoke out against the bomb were necessarily...
Because I see a lot of people being like, well, hold up, I thought they were doing it to flex on the USSR or whatever. Like, that. No, that is the final conclusion of this story. It's just that this aspect is basically discussing all other alternative motives.
Lying or wrong. We know from what we've talked about today that the Japanese leadership was close to surrender and was, as President Truman wrote in his diary, asking for peace. Japan would have surrendered long before an invasion if, for instance, they thought they could secure terms which were acceptable to them. They didn't actually want to be invaded just for the sake of it, they were holding out for an invasion in the hopes of avoiding an unconditional surrender. So US military leaders who claimed the bombs were not necessary to end the war were correct, even if they had an ulterior motive for saying so. Instead of a motivation to lie, they could just have easily have had a motivation to tell an uncomfortable truth. So then, were the bombs necessary to force Japan to offer to surrender on the Allied terms without any conditions? And the answer to this is also no, because they didn't do that. Even after...
We're not watching the whole thing. I'm just showing you the final discussion.
2 atomic bombs, the Japanese leadership still only offered to surrender on the condition that they were assured they could keep the emperor. And between that offer to surrender and their eventual actual surrender, they didn't get hit with any more nuclear bombs. All this being said, I do not think that the nuclear bombs had absolutely no effect at all on Japan's decision to surrender. It would be going much too far to make that claim, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I'd say there were 2 main effects that the bombs had upon the end of the war. Firstly, the nuclear bomb probably indirectly shortened the war, because its existence prompted Truman to try to finish the war without the Soviet Union, which in turn prompted Stalin to speed up his plans to declare war on Japan, and that declaration of war sped up the emperor intervening in the Supreme Council to bring about an offer to surrender, with their condition, of course. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan on the 8th of August, and it's likely that if they weren't racing to get in the war as quickly as possible, they would have declared war later in August sometime. The 15th is what Stalin told Truman at Potsdam. So we can say that, all other things being equal, the existence of the atomic bomb probably shortened the war by a week or so. The other effect the nuclear bomb had on the end of the war is a rather interesting one. And let's read a post-war quote from Cabinet Secretary Sakomizu talking about the bomb. The chance had come to end the war. It was not necessary to blame the military side, the manufacturing people, or anyone else. Just the atomic bomb. It was a good excuse. Someone said the atomic bomb was the kamikaze to save Japan. So, the bomb provided the non-military Japanese leadership with an excuse to proclaim defeat that didn't involve blaming or shaming their proud military. It lessened the risk of a revolt of the armed forces, and it was a way to end the war while salvaging some pride, as well as casting those killed by the bombs not as civilian war victims, but as heroic martyrs. The Emperor's radio announcement declaring the end of the war took a similar approach. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb.
It's such a weird thing to just like try to look at the positive aspects of this, you know what I mean? But I think it's good to cover it because it then shows you how ridiculous it was to drop the bomb in and of itself, to let the emperor save face. Like, you're stretching extra hard to find any meaningful way of trying to justify it. You know what I mean? It's almost as ridiculous as like fucking talking about how anime became a thing. So I guess it was kind of all right. You know what I mean? Like, guys, I know the nuclear bombs happened, but also like anime, you know, which led to the creation of One Piece. I mean, think about that. Hideo Kojima made some fucking bangers, you know? Ridiculous. You always have to weigh the consequences, certainly, but I think in this situation, at least, when you weigh the consequences, you realize, unlike the top of the hour ad break, which comes at the top of every hour, which is 3 minutes long, that you can totally avoid with a $5 a month subscription or a free one in the form of a Twitch Prime, the nuclear bomb was not worth it. The atom bomb was not worth it. Just simply was not. That's it. But the 3-minute ad break could be worth it for you. But if you don't think it is, then all you need to do is subscribe for $5 or free with a Twitch Prime by connecting your Amazon Prime account to your Twitch account where you get 1 free Prime subscription a month. Here is the 3-minute ad break now. All right, I'm done with this, and I'm done with Oppenheimer, Sloppenheimer. Here.